Role-playing games have long been regarded as the epitome of interactive storytelling, transcending simple entertainment to offer players profound, meaningful experiences. From the very first text-based adventures to the expansive open worlds of modern titles, RPGs have not only allowed players to assume roles, but also to mold characters, navigate complex narratives, and influence the fates of entire universes. However, this medium has evolved over the decades, perhaps in ways that have unintentionally diminished the very essence that made it unique. This evolution represents one of gaming's most fascinating paradoxes. As RPGs have grown more technically sophisticated, visually stunning, and commercially successful, many genre purists argue they have simultaneously lost something fundamental. The journey from tabletop origins to digital dominance has been marked by critical design decisions that prioritize accessibility over depth, spectacle over agency, and guided experiences over genuine role-playing freedom. The earliest digital RPGs emerged as a direct translation of their tabletop counterparts, preserving complex character creation systems, stat-driven interactions, and narrative consequences that genuinely reflected player choice. Games like Ultima, Wizardry, and early Fallout titles demanded players inhabit their characters fully, making decisions based not just on optimal outcomes but on consistent role-playing principles. The mechanical underpinnings of these games supported this approach, with robust skill systems, faction dynamics, and dialogue trees that branched meaningfully based on character attributes rather than simplistic binary choices. As technology advanced and market pressures intensified, developers began streamlining these systems. Character classes became less distinct, skill checks grew rarer in dialogue, and consequences for actions became increasingly cosmetic rather than structural. The industry's pivot towards action-oriented gameplay further accelerated this trend, with many modern RPGs offering little more than superficial character customization layered atop essentially linear action-adventure frameworks. Perhaps more tellingly, the narrative focus shifted dramatically. Where early RPGs presented worlds to be discovered through exploration and player initiative, contemporary titles increasingly deliver cinematic experiences where player involvement serves primarily to advance predetermined storylines. The player transitions from active participant shaping an emerging narrative to audience member occasionally steering a largely fixed one. This shift reflects broader cultural changes in entertainment consumption, where passive media experiences have conditioned audiences to expect polished, directed narratives rather than messy but authentic, player-driven stories. This is not merely a lament for the past, but a detailed autopsy of how the RPG genre metamorphosed. We'll dissect how, through shifts in mechanics, narrative design, and world-building, the genre veered away from its rich roots, transforming into something arguably more accessible, but ultimately less distinctive. In this exploration, we will trace the game mechanics, narrative designs, and philosophical choices that changed the very fabric of RPGs, leaving behind a legacy of missed opportunities and potential. In the heyday of turn-based combat, every combat encounter was an opportunity for storytelling. This was not just about hitting attack and hoping for the best, but about placing each decision within the broader context of the game's world. Classic RPGs like Baldur's Gate and Fallout understood that combat wasn't just a mechanic, it was an extension of the narrative itself. Each turn was a moment where the player's strategic decisions influenced the unfolding of events in a meaningful way. Final Fantasy and Shining Force utilized turn-based combat as a way to pause the action and allow players to think deeply about their choices, from positioning units on the battlefield to the precise use of resources. Combat, in this sense, felt deliberate, important, and tied into the very DNA of storytelling. These early systems created spaces for consequential decision-making that reflected character development. A mage with limited hit points didn't charge into battle. This tactical vulnerability wasn't just a gameplay constraint, but a narrative reinforcement of the character's identity. Similarly, positioning a heavily armored knight to protect weaker party members wasn't merely optimal play. It embodied the protective role that a character served within the group's dynamic. The measured pace allowed for dramatic tension to build naturally, as players contemplated the weight of each action, creating memorable moments when a carefully planned strategy either succeeded brilliantly or failed catastrophically. Moreover, turn-based systems invited players to engage with the full breadth of their character's capabilities. Rather than defaulting to the most obvious or efficient attack patterns, players explore situational abilities, status effects, and environmental interactions that might otherwise be overlooked in faster-paced combat. Games like Chrono Trigger elevated this approach by implementing combo attacks that encourage players to consider party composition as an extension of storytelling. Certain characters working together reflected their narrative relationships and development arcs. However, over time, combat systems evolve under the pressure of technological innovation and shifting player expectations. The rise of action-based combat, as seen in Dark Souls, was hailed as a breakthrough. Its fast-paced, reflexive nature challenged players to master timing and movement. While mechanically impressive, it shifted the role of combat away from strategic storytelling into a test of player dexterity. What was once a narrative choice became an adrenaline-filled performance, where precision reflexes replaced critical thinking and the careful weighing of options. This transition was not inherently negative. Action combat systems can be brilliantly executed and deeply engaging. Yet something fundamental was sacrificed in this evolution: the intrinsic connection between combat mechanics and character identity. When success depends primarily on the player's physical skill rather than character attributes and strategic thinking, the role-playing element diminishes. A wizard and a warrior might employ different animations and visual effects, but the core experience increasingly revolves around similar timing-based mechanics regardless of character type. In modern titles, combat no longer feels like an extension of the world building, but often a hollow pursuit of a spectacle. It's a trend seen across the industry, where developers prioritize visually striking combat systems at the expense of strategic depth and meaningful player choice. Games like Dragon Age Inquisition attempted to bridge this divide with hybrid systems, but often resulted in unsatisfying compromises that pleased neither traditionalist nor action enthusiast. The tactical overlay feature, ostensibly included to preserve strategic elements, frequently went unused as players defaulted to direct control and reflex-based engagement. The industry's embrace of accessibility often served as a justification for this simplification, but in streamlining these systems, developers inadvertently flattened the very features that made RPG combat distinctive. Complex status effects, positioning advantages, and resource management decisions gave way to more homogenized combat loops focused on damage output and spectacle. What was lost wasn't merely mechanical complexity, but the narrative texture that these systems once provided. The sense that combat reflected something meaningful about character identity and the world itself. In the early RPGs, stat allocation was far more than a mere number-crunching exercise. It was a philosophical commitment. It represented who your character was in the world. A character with low strength but high intelligence wasn't simply a weak fighter. They were someone who relied on wit and cunning, perhaps using diplomacy or trickery to resolve conflicts. The way a player allocated stats spoke volumes about the role they wanted to play in the narrative, and how they saw their character fitting into the larger world. Games like Baldur's Gate and Planetscape Torment embrace this philosophy wholeheartedly. A highly charismatic character might talk their way past obstacles that would require combat for others. A perceptive character might notice hidden passages or deceptions that others would miss entirely. These weren't simply different means to the same end. They represented fundamentally different journeys through the game world, with unique narrative consequences and discoveries tied to each approach. This system created natural replayability that emerged organically from character identity rather than arbitrary achievement hunting. Players would return to these worlds not just to experience different endings, but to inhabit entirely different roles within the same narrative framework. The limitations imposed by stat distribution weren't frustrating restrictions, but the very foundation of role-playing. They defined not just what your character could do, but who they fundamentally were. Fast forward to contemporary RPGs, where character creation has often been reduced to choosing an avatar and tweaking some numbers. Many modern titles, such as those in the Mass Effect or the Elder Scrolls series, still feature skill systems, but the impact of those choices has diminished. Specialization, once a cornerstone of RPG design, has all but disappeared. Players can easily respect their stats, removing the very concept of limitations and the narrative depth those limitations once provided. The result? Characters feel interchangeable, and the experience of carving out a unique identity in the game world is less fulfilling. This erosion extends beyond numerical attributes to the very idea of character identity. Modern RPGs increasingly position players as universal protagonists, capable of mastering every skill, joining every faction, and experiencing all content in a single playthrough. While superficially empowering, this approach fundamentally undermines the role-playing premise. When a character can become guild master of both the Thieves Guild and the Mages College without any meaningful conflict or consequence, the world itself feels less coherent and responsive. The industry's emphasis on quality of life improvements has inadvertently contributed to this decline. Features like simplified skill trees, automatic leveling options, and recommended builds cater to convenience at the expense of meaningful player investment in character development. While ostensibly making games more accessible, these changes have hollowed out what once made character creation a profound act of self-expression within the game world. Perhaps most concerning is how this shift reflects a broader philosophical change in how players are expected to engage with these worlds. The original ethos of role-playing emphasized inhabiting a character with specific strengths, weaknesses, and perspectives, embracing limitations as part of the narrative experience. Today's design philosophy increasingly treats limitations as frustrations to be eliminated, resulting in protagonists who are less characters within a world and more avatars for experiencing content without meaningful restrictions or consequences. Once upon a time, RPGs excelled in dialogue complexity. Planetscape Torment famously featured multi-layered conversations that could stretch hundreds of words, diving into deep philosophical questions about existence, morality, and the nature of the self. Characters weren't simply there to give you quests, they were integral to shaping the narrative, offering different viewpoints and challenging the player's ideas. These dialogues weren't merely verbose, they were architecturally complex. Conversations branched based on character attributes, previous decisions, and accumulated knowledge, creating a web of potential interactions rather than a linear path. A player with high intelligence might unlock philosophical discussions that were simply unavailable to other character builds. In Fallout, a low intelligence character would receive entirely different dialogue options, fundamentally altering the player's experience of the narrative. The fact that entire questlines, insights, and relationships could be locked behind specific character attributes meant that conversations themselves became explorations, archaeological digs into the game's narrative possibilities. The density of these dialogue systems created a particular kind of immersion, one that demanded attention and rewarded careful reading. Games like Arcanum of Steamworks and Magic Obscura and Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines trusted players to engage with complex political factions, philosophical schools of thought, and moral quandaries without simplification. This approach treated players as intellectual participants in the narrative rather than merely emotional ones, expecting them to weigh competing worldviews and form their own conclusions. Fast forward to the present day, and dialogue has become shorter, more formulaic, and focused on instant emotional payoffs. AAA RPGs now feature interactions that range from one-liners to quippy exchanges, designed to evoke immediate emotional responses rather than provoke critical thought or challenge the player. In The Witcher 3, while still beautifully written, most conversations are purposefully designed for maximum player engagement, quick, easy to understand, and emotionally charged. The complexity of choice, however, has been drastically diminished. The modern dialogue wheel, popularized by Mass Effect and now ubiquitous across the genre, epitomizes this shift. Conversations are reduced to simplify emotional tones: aggressive, diplomatic, humorous, or investigative. This system prioritizes accessibility and pacing over nuance, reducing the art of conversation to a series of emotional stances rather than substantive exchanges of ideas. While these systems allow for voice protagonists and more cinematic presentations, they have fundamentally altered how players engage with narrative content, favoring immediacy over depth. It's impossible to ignore the influence of broader media trends on video game writing. Hollywood's emphasis on quick, marketable dialogue and emotional beats embodied in blockbusters like the Marvel Cinematic Universe has permeated into the RPG space. Developers are now more concerned with ensuring their characters are relatable, often to the point of sounding undistinguishable. Quips, snarky remarks, and emotionally predictable arcs dominate the conversation, leaving little room for the kind of rich thematic dialogues that was once a hallmark of the genre. This shift manifests in multiple ways. Characters increasingly speak in a homogenized writer's voice, rather than distinct in dialogues or speech patterns tied to their backgrounds. Regional accents and linguistic quirks, once used to subtly reinforce world-building, give way to universally accessible banter. Companions and NPCs deliver carefully calibrated one-liners designed for maximum meme potential rather than authentic character development. The goal seems to be creating characters who could seamlessly transition into transmedia properties rather than those who meaningfully inhabit specific fictional worlds. Perhaps most tellingly, modern RPG dialogue increasingly avoids genuine ideological diversity or challenging perspectives. Where classic RPGs like Fallout New Vegas feature factions with fundamentally different, morally complex worldviews, contemporary titles often reduce political and philosophical differences to simplistic conflicts that are easily resolved through player intervention. The result is narratives that feel thematically shallower and less willing to challenge players with genuinely difficult ethical decisions or uncomfortable perspectives. The standardization of dialogue patterns across major studios further reinforces this trend. As developmental teams grow larger and more international, dialogue undergoes multiple rounds of revision, localization, and focus testing, processes that, while necessary for global releases, often sand away linguistic idiosyncrasies and cultural specificity. What emerges are conversations designed not to offend, confuse, or challenge, but to deliver reliably engaging emotional beats across cultural contexts. The modern RPG faces a unique challenge, balancing the desire for inclusive representation with the necessity for meaningful narrative complexity. In an effort to be more inclusive, games are often tempted to adopt a checkbox approach to character creation and storylines, where characters are assigned identities for the sake of diversity, but without the depth or context needed to make those characters feel real or integral to the story. The result is often a shallow veneer of representation where characters exist more as symbols than as fully realized people. This approach creates a fundamental tension. Characters become simultaneously hyper-visible as representatives of particular identities, while their actual narrative development receives less attention than in previous generations of RPGs. Where older titles might have dedicated substantial dialogue trees to exploring a character's background, beliefs, and personal growth, modern games often relegate such development to optional side conversations that many players never experience. The commercial imperative to appeal to the widest possible audience means that these personal narratives rarely challenge players' preconceptions or explore genuine cultural complexity. The representation paradox extends beyond character development to world building itself. Fantasy worlds that once drew inspiration from a specific historical context or cultural traditions increasingly adopt generic settings where social structures lack the specificity that might create meaningful narrative friction. Racism, classism, and religious conflict, themes that creators like BioWare once explored with relative nuance, are either absent entirely or presented in simplified metaphorical forms that avoid engaging with the messy realities of these issues. This trend leads to characters that are more performative than they are profound. Their identities are often reduced to a set of characteristics or a catchphrase, devoid of the cultural and personal nuance that made characters in older RPGs feel multidimensional. Where a character like Kreia in Knights of the Old Republic 2 embodied a complex philosophical position that challenged the player throughout the narrative, modern companions often represent simplified personality types rather than distinctive worldviews. The irony is that in attempting to create more inclusive narratives, many modern RPGs have actually reduced the depth and specificity that would make diverse characters truly compelling. Representation without depth ultimately undermines its own goals, creating the appearance of diversity while failing to engage with the rich complexity of human experience that makes diverse perspectives valuable in the first place. The most successful modern RPGs are those that recognize this paradox and work to provide both breadth of representation and depth of characterization, understanding that genuine inclusion requires more than visual diversity, it demands narrative investment. In the golden era of RPGs, worlds were not just large, they were carefully curated. Developers spent years meticulously crafting each area to feel not just like a place to explore, but like a piece of a larger story. Games like Baldur's Gate and Planetscape Torment were celebrated not only for their detailed environments, but also for the way those environments were imbued with history and purpose. Every corner of the map had a reason for existing. Each street in Baldur's Gate wasn't just a space to navigate, but a narrative vehicle, telling stories through its architecture, NPC interactions, and questlines. Players didn't just explore, they uncover meaning in the world around them. These handcrafted worlds foster a particular kind of immersion that emerged from narrative density rather than a mere spatial vastness. The Hive in Planetscape Torment wasn't impressive for its size, but for its layered complexity. Every NPC, storefront, and back alley felt connected to the district's history, economy, and social dynamics. Similarly, locations like Athkatla in Baldur's Gate 2 weren't designed as playgrounds but as living communities with internal logic, political tensions, and historical significance. When players discover a hidden room or stumble upon an obscure NPC, they weren't just finding content, they were deepening their understanding of the world itself. This approach to world design treated environments as text to be read rather than merely spaces to be traversed. The architecture of Sigil in Planetscape wasn't arbitrary, but reflective of the city's impossible metaphysical position. The layered Vol City in Fallout 2 communicated volumes about its isolationist ideology and class structure without requiring explicit exposition. These environments achieved a kind of environmental storytelling that worked in concert with the game's narrative, rather than merely serving as its backdrop. In stark contrast, we now live in an age of procedural generation, where the vastness of worlds is prioritized over the depth within them. Games like Starfield promise players a nearly endless universe of over 1,000 planets to explore. It's an impressive technical feat, but it comes at the cost of meaningful content. Procedurally generated worlds often lack the cohesion and storytelling that handcrafted locations offer. A vast number of planets means that most of them are bereft of intricate lore, quest, or unique environments, leaving them as mere empty landscapes. Exploration becomes about collecting resources or ticking off checklists, rather than diving into a world rich with narrative depth. This shift towards procedural generation has fundamentally altered the relationship between players and the game worlds. Where exploration in traditional RPGs was motivated by curiosity and narrative discovery, modern open worlds often incentivize exploration through achievement systems and collectible hunts. The joy of uncovering a hidden story has been largely replaced by the dopamine hit of clearing icons from a map. Even when handcrafted content exists within these procedural generated frameworks, it often feels disconnected from its surroundings, narrative islands in scenes of algorithmic emptiness. This shift towards algorithmic creation has diluted the magic that RPG worlds once held. When a world is built by hand, it reflects the creative intent and vision of its developers. Procedural generation, while impressive, doesn't capture the same nuance. The player feels less like a part of a living, breathing world and more like a tourist in a vast artificial sandbox. The irony is that technological advancement has enabled the creation of visually stunning environments with unprecedented detail. Yet these spaces often feel less alive than the comparatively primitive worlds of earlier RPGs. Modern games can render individual leaves on trees and realistic weather patterns, but struggle to create places that feel like they existed before the player arrived and will continue to exist after they leave, a quality that even text-based MUDs and early CRPGs somehow managed to achieve with far fewer resources. In the past, RPG worlds didn't begin and end at the game's start and finish screens. The narrative in the universe could continue to evolve through novels, comics, developer interviews, and fan-driven lore. Think of the Elder Scrolls series, where players could dive into a multitude of books within the game world, each one expanding the history and culture of Tamriel. Similarly, Final Fantasy lore didn't just live on screen but expanded into spin-off games, anime, and other media, enriching the player's understanding of its universe. This transmedia approach wasn't merely additive, but transformative, creating narrative ecosystems where different media forms contributed unique elements to a cohesive whole. The Forgotten Realms setting that housed Baldur's Gate was simultaneously explored through novels, tabletop campaigns, and other video games, each medium leveraging its strengths to illuminate different aspects of the shared world. Novels could delve into character psychology and historical events. Tabletop sessions could explore player-driven narratives within established frameworks, and video games could render these worlds interactive. The result was a form of world building greater than the sum of its parts. Crucially, these transmedia extensions weren't just consumed passively but actively integrated into how players experience the games themselves. A player who read R.A. Salvatore Dritt's novels might approach Drow characters in Baldur's Gate with different expectations and interpretations. Someone familiar with the intricate political histories detailed in Elder Scrolls in-game books might make different moral choices when confronted with factional conflicts. The boundary between game and extended universe was permeable, creating feedback loops that enrich both. These extra game materials didn't just feel like filler or marketing, they were a natural extension of the world building. They deepened the lore, offer players new insights, and allow them to experience the universe through different lenses. The Mass Effect series, for example, became a full-fledged transmedia property with novels, comics, and an expansive lore archive that drew fans even deeper into its rich universe. But today, much of this holistic world building has eroded into something far less substantive. Transmedia content now often serves as little more than marketing collateral. Consider the tie-in novels or comics that accompany modern RPGs. They're often released as afterthoughts, designed to plug gaps in the game's narrative rather than expand upon it meaningfully. They serve as a marketing function, giving players just enough to feel like they're getting more but not enough to truly flesh out the world they've come to love. This synchronization of these transmedia elements has also suffered. Where once books and games hold complementary stories within a consistent universe, modern franchises frequently struggle with contradictions between media formats. Retcons become commonplace as marketing priorities shift, eroding player trust in the coherence of these worlds. The result is a fragmentation of narrative universes, where players increasingly focus only on canon game content and dismiss external materials as unreliable or irrelevant. Perhaps most concerning is how this approach has affected game design itself. As transmedia extensions become more marketing-focused and less substantive, games themselves must shoulder the entire burden of world building. This leads to bloated expositions, codex entries that feel disconnected from gameplay, and narrative structures that prioritize setting up sequels over telling complete stories. The game becomes simultaneously overcrowded with lore dumps yet paradoxically shallow in its world building. This loss of a rich transmedia ecosystem results in RPGs feeling increasingly isolated, their universe confined to the game itself rather than being part of a broader cultural conversation. The RPGs of today risk being games within games, their worlds becoming static, shallow, and forgettable once players put down their controllers. When you think of faction systems done right, Fallout New Vegas stands as a paragon of the genre. The game allowed players to engage with factions on a profound level, where their choices not only impacted their standing with each group, but also determined the fate of the wasteland. The complexity of the faction system was an intricate web of alliances, betrayals, and moral compromises. Players could choose to ally with the New Californian Republic, the Caesar's Legion, or even go solo. Each choice had consequences that rippled throughout the game's narrative. What made New Vegas particularly remarkable was how it positioned factions not merely as quest givers but as ideological forces with coherent worldviews. Caesar's Legion wasn't simply evil. They were a response to the chaos of the wasteland, offering brutal order and security at the cost of individual freedom. The NCR represented democratic values and rule of law, but also bureaucratic inefficiency and imperial overreach. Mr. House embodied technocratic utopianism with its promises of progress and its authoritarian undertones. Each faction presented a different vision for humanity's future, asking players to consider not just which side to support, but what kind of world they wanted to help create. This philosophical depth was matched by mechanical sophistication. The reputation system tracked not just whether factions liked or disliked the player, but whether they were respected, feared, or merely tolerated. A player might be revered by the NCR for their help but still distrusted for past associations with their enemies, a nuance rarely captured in modern systems. Most importantly, these reputations weren't merely cosmetic but determined access to areas, dialogue options, quest possibilities, and ultimately, the narrative branches available to the player. In New Vegas, your relationship with a faction could shift dynamically based on your actions, whether it was completing quests for them, betraying their leaders, or siding with their enemies. This gave the player agency and a genuine sense of influence over their world. The decisions felt meaningful because the consequences were real. If you sided with one faction, you risked alienating another, and each faction had its own goals, philosophy, and role in shaping the game's outcome. The brilliance of this system lay in how it created narrative tension through mechanical constraints. Players couldn't simply max out reputation with every faction. The game forced them to make choices that would inevitably close off certain paths. This wasn't an artificial limitation, but a reflection of the game's central theme about the impossibility of pleasing everyone in a world of conflicting interests. The faction system wasn't just a gameplay mechanism, it was a narrative device that embodied the game's philosophical exploration of power, governance, and moral compromise. This complexity made the world feel alive, as though your actions had weight. The faction mechanics weren't just about filling a meter or earning a reputation. They were about understanding the power dynamics and making difficult choices that shape the world in profound ways. Contrast that with the modern iteration of faction systems, where reputation meters dominate. In many contemporary RPGs, factions serve more as a checklist to be ticked off than as living, breathing entities with which the player can form real, complex relationships. Actions in these games often don't have lasting consequences. Increasing a faction's reputation by completing a few tasks might lead to rewards, but these rewards rarely affect the storyline in a meaningful way. The modern approach typically treats factions as content delivery systems rather than ideological entities. A player can often be simultaneously aligned with groups that should logically be at odds with one another. In games like The Elder Scrolls V and Skyrim, players can become the leader of the Thieves' Guild, the Companions, the College of Winterhold, and the Dark Brotherhood without any meaningful narrative friction between these roles. This approach prioritizes player access to all content over narrative coherence, fundamentally undermining the concept of meaningful choice. Even when games attempt to implement opposing factions, the consequences of alignment are frequently reduced to cosmetic differences or slightly altered endings rather than fundamentally different gameplay experiences. Players might receive different cutscenes or dialogue, but the core gameplay loop remains unchanged regardless of faction choice. The narrative might acknowledge the player's allegiance, but the game world rarely transforms in response to it. In the modern RPG, factions often feel like a series of disconnected quests that you can complete without engaging in the nuanced storytelling of older games. Factions no longer feel like they have real stakes in the world, and your role within them is often predefined, with minimal impact on the game's ultimate outcome. Instead of struggling with the moral complexities of supporting one faction over another, players are presented with surface-level decisions that don't force them to confront difficult choices. This design philosophy reflects a fundamental shift in how developers view player experience. Where older RPGs were willing to lock significant content behind mutually exclusive choices, creating replayability through genuine narrative divergence, modern titles often avoid restricting access to content at all costs. This approach stems partly from development economics. Creating substantial content that many players might never see is considered inefficient. It also reflects changing player expectations, with many gamers expressing frustration when they can experience all content in a single playthrough. The reputation systems themselves have been mechanically simplified as well. Where New Vegas tracked multiple dimensions of faction relationships, fame, infamy, trust, distrust, most modern systems collapse these nuances into a single meter. This reduction eliminates the possibility of complex stand-ins, being simultaneously feared and respected or being distrusted despite providing valuable assistance. The rich texture of human relationships is flooded into a simplistic approval rating that rises and falls predictably based on quest completion. This lack of narrative depth diminishes the impact of the faction systems, reducing what was once an intricate web of interwoven stories into a series of automated predictable interactions that lack the weight of their predecessors. The player becomes less an agent making consequential choices in a reactive world and more a tourist passing through various content zones, collecting experiences without leaving a meaningful mark on the game's universe. The decline of complex faction systems represents more than just a mechanical simplification. It signifies a philosophical retreat from the idea that meaningful role-playing emerges from limitation in consequence rather than from unlimited agency. When players can experience everything without sacrifice, choose any path without closing others, and maintain positive relationships with everyone regardless of their actions, the very concept of role-playing, of inhabiting a specific character with specific allegiances and values, is fundamentally compromised. Romance in RPGs has undergone a dramatic transformation, from an optional, deeply integrated narrative element to a primary mechanic often designed to please the masses. In the early days of RPGs, romances were woven seamlessly into the broader story. Take Baldur's Gate, where romance options were not a central focus but a means of exploring the emotional complexity of the characters. These romances felt like natural extensions of the characters' personalities and the player's role in the world, rather than a mechanic designed for the sake of player satisfaction. What made these early romantic narratives compelling was their unpredictability and narrative integration. Characters like Viconia and Baldur's Gate 2 brought their own agendas, traumas, and worldviews to their relationships with the player character. These weren't simply romance options, but fully realized personalities whose capacity for romantic attachment was one facet of their complex characterization. A romance with Viconia wasn't merely about pursuing a drow companion, but about navigating her complicated relationship with surface dwellers, her traumatic past, and her evolving moral compass. These relationships could challenge players in ways that modern romances rarely attempt. Characters might disagree with the player's choices, abandon the party if their personal ethics were compromised, or even betray the protagonist if their goals diverged significantly. This unpredictability created genuine emotional stakes. The player couldn't simply select the correct dialogue option to guarantee a successful relationship, but had to engage with the character as a complex individual with their own motivations and boundaries. These relationships weren't just about fulfilling a desire for a romantic subplot. They were about exploring a deep connection with another person, even if that connection could influence the narrative or change the character's role in the story. The Witcher 3, despite its rich narrative, exemplifies the modern approach, where romance is often treated as a side quest, one that requires specific actions or dialogues to unlock, rather than something that evolves organically within the context of the story. The codification of romance as a discrete game system rather than a narrative possibility represents one of the most significant shifts in how RPGs approach character relationships. Modern games typically flag romantic possibilities explicitly, using interface elements like heart icons or relationship meters to signal when a conversation has romantic implications. This approach removes ambiguity and surprise from these interactions, reducing what should be complex emotional terrain to a series of clearly marked choices with predictable outcomes. In more recent RPGs, romance has become a reward system, where players can earn the affections of their companions as a form of progression or validation. These relationships often feel shallow and more like a dating simulator than a natural evolution of character interaction. Romance in these games is no longer about deep emotional exploration, but about unlocking rewards and achieving a sense of completion. This mechanical approach extends beyond just dialogue choices. In many modern RPGs, relationship progression follows predictable patterns: initial meeting, followed by a personal quest, culminating in a romantic scene that serves as a capstone to the relationship arc. This formulaic structure places romance on the same plane as equipment upgrades or skill trees, another system to be optimized rather than an organic narrative possibility. Players quickly learn to recognize and follow these patterns, turning what should be emotionally resonant experiences into checklist items. The standardization of romance mechanics across the industry has further eroded their narrative impact. Players now expect certain conventions, the ability to pursue multiple romantic interests simultaneously until a lock-in point, romantic scenes as rewards for relationship completion, and minimal consequences for relationship choices. These expectations create development constraints that limit narrative innovation in how games approach romantic relationships. Perhaps most concerning is how this approach flattens character psychology. Where romance in earlier RPGs could reveal unexpected dimensions of companions, vulnerabilities, desires, or moral complexities not evident in their general characterization, modern romances often simply amplify traits already present in the character's public persona. The brooding character becomes more introspective, the flirtatious character more overtly sexual, the stoic warrior more protective. These predictable developments offer few genuine surprises or insights into character psychology. This transformation reflects a broader simplification of character interaction in modern RPGs. Companions who once had complex motivations, personal quests that could be fail or refuse, and the ability to leave the party if sufficiently alienated have largely been replaced by eternally loyal followers whose personal content exists primarily to strengthen their bond with the protagonist. The result is relationships that feel less like genuine connections between complex individuals and more like achievement paths designed to maximize the player's satisfaction. The mechanization of romance has not only diminished its narrative potential, but also reinforced problematic patterns in how games approach interpersonal relationships. When romance becomes a system to be mastered rather than a narrative possibility to be explored, it implicitly frames relationships as transactional. Complete this task, select these dialogue options, and earn affection as a reward. This approach risks reducing companions to prizes to be won rather than individuals to be understood, a particularly troubling framework given gaming's ongoing struggles with representation and objectification. What has been lost in this evolution is the very essence of what made romantic narratives compelling in RPGs, their capacity to surprise, challenge, and even disappoint players in ways that feel emotionally authentic. By prioritizing player satisfaction over narrative coherence, modern RPGs have created romance systems that are more accessible but ultimately less meaningful, offering the illusion of emotional connection without the narrative depth or complexity that would make these relationships truly resonant. The evolution of open-world design in RPGs represents one of the most profound transformations in gaming, from carefully bounded explorations to seemingly limitless expanses promising freedom without restraint. This shift has not been made without significant cost. What began as a genuine innovation in player agency has devolved into a marketing metric, where the square mileage of a game world has become more important than the density of meaningful experiences contained within it. Starfield stands as perhaps the most emblematic example of this misguided philosophy. Bethesda's promise of over 1,000 explorable planets exemplifies the fundamental misunderstanding that has infected modern RPG design: the conflation of size with substance. These numerically impressive worlds offer an illusion of infinity that quickly reveals itself as repetition disguised as variety. Players find themselves traversing not unique environments but variations on a limited set of algorithmic templates: mountains with a slightly different coloration, deserts with marginally altered rock formations, forests distinguished only by trivial difference in flora density. This approach represents a profound misreading of what made early open worlds compelling. Games like Morrowind captivated players not through sheer size but through cultural depth, architectural distinctiveness, and ecological coherence. Each region felt like a place shaped by history and inhabited by people with comprehensible social structures. By contrast, the procedurally generated planets of games like Starfield and No Man's Sky present themselves as geological curiosities rather than living worlds, offering little evidence of organic development or meaningful habitation. The mechanical implementation of these open worlds has further eroded their narrative potential. What was once genuine exploration, the act of discovering the unknown through curiosity and observation, has been reduced to following waypoint markers across vast, empty terrains. The journey between objectives has become a form of tedium rather than an opportunity for discovery, with players often resorting to fast travel systems that effectively acknowledge the emptiness of the spaces between narrative nodes. This design approach transforms exploration from an active engagement with a richly realized world into a checklist of locations to be systematically cleared. The map interface, once a tool to aid navigation, has become the primary lens through which players experience these worlds, a series of icons representing content to be consumed rather than a territory to be understood. The player's relationship with the game world is fundamentally altered. Rather than inhabiting a space, they move between content islands in an otherwise barren sea. The proliferation of collectibles and resource nodes as the primary form of environmental interaction further demonstrates this impoverishment of design. Where early RPGs used environmental storytelling to create narrative context, abandoned camps with evidence of what transpired, ruins with architectural clues about past civilizations, modern open worlds often substitute these thoughtful touches with generic resource deposits and standardized enemy encounters that could exist anywhere, untethered from any sense of place or purpose. This expansiveness has not only affected environmental design, but has fundamentally altered how stories can be told within these spaces. The vastness of modern open worlds creates an irreconcilable tension between narrative coherence and player freedom. When critical story missions can be indefinitely postponed while players wander across enormous territories, the sense of urgency or emotional investment in central conflicts inevitably diminishes. Games like Skyrim demonstrate how this tension can undermine storytelling, with world-threatening crises that patiently wait for the player to complete hundreds of unrelated side activities before addressing them. The narrative dissonance created by this approach, where the supposed apocalyptic threat never actually advances despite in-game days and weeks passing, erodes the player's ability to meaningfully engage with the central story. More concerning is how this expanded scale has affected character writing. With resources stretched across vast territories and countless quests, the depth of characterization has suffered accordingly. Side characters who might once have received nuanced development are reduced to quest dispensers with minimal personality beyond their immediate function. The quantity of NPCs has expanded while their individual complexity has contracted, resulting in worlds that feel paradoxically less populated despite containing more characters. What has been lost in this pursuit of expansiveness is the understanding that limitations can foster creativity. The more bounded worlds of early RPGs encourage developers to maximize the narrative potential of each location, to ensure that every accessible area contains something worth discovering. The finite nature of these worlds created a density of experience that made exploration genuinely rewarding rather than merely time-consuming. The path forward for open-world RPGs lies not in ever-expanding territories, but in returning to this principle of meaningful density, creating worlds that may be smaller in raw geographic terms, but richer in narrative possibility and interactive potential. Some developers have begun to recognize this, crafting more contained experiences where the boundaries serve not as limitations but as focusing mechanisms for more carefully designed content. Until the industry broadly reconsiders its equation of scale with value, players will continue to find themselves adrift in beautiful but empty digital landscapes, technically impressive but emotionally hollow, offering the superficial appearance of limitless possibility while actually constraining the depth of interaction that makes RPGs truly meaningful. The vastness of these worlds has become not a feature but a symptom of design philosophy that has lost sight of why players explore virtual spaces, not to wander aimlessly, but to discover stories worth experiencing. The Western RPG stands at a crucial crossroads, one path continuing towards further dilution and mechanical homogenization, the other leading back towards the rich narrative soil from which the genre first grew. This moment of uncertainty presents not just a challenge but an opportunity for profound reinvention. The genre's salvation lies not in abandoning its evolution entirely, but in rediscovering the fundamental principles that made role-playing games uniquely powerful as interactive experiences. What made classical RPGs compelling was never merely their systems or their scale, but their commitment to player agency within coherent narrative frameworks. These games understood that meaningful choice requires consequences that reshape not just immediate outcomes but the broader trajectory of the player's journey. The degradation of choice into cosmetic variations of the same essential path represents perhaps the most significant betrayal of the genre's potential, reducing what should have been transformative decisions into mere aesthetic preferences. Signs of revival already exist on the periphery of mainstream development. Studios like Larian have demonstrated with Baldur's Gate 3 that players hunger for genuine consequence in their choices, for worlds that respond to not just different dialogue but with fundamentally altered paths forward. These experiences remind us that the true power of the RPG lies not in the breadth of its world, but in the depth of its responsiveness to player action. The resurrection of the Western RPG requires a recalibration of priorities, away from the market-driven impulse towards universal accessibility and back towards the understanding that depth sometimes requires complexity. Not every game must appeal to every player. Indeed, the most memorable experiences often emerge from developers who embrace the specific nature of their vision rather than diluting it to reach the broadest possible audience. Part of this renewal must include a recognition that limitations can foster creativity rather than constrain it. The most narratively rich RPGs have often been those with clearly defined boundaries, both in their worlds and their systems, that allow developers to focus on creating density of experience rather than expanse of territory. A return to more concentrated design would permit the kind of handcrafted detail and narrative intricacy that procedural generation and endless scale inevitably sacrifice. Character development, too, must reclaim its position at the heart of the genre. The reduction of companions to mechanical assets or romantic conquest has diminished what was once the emotional core of the RPG experience. The formation of complex relationships with virtual people whose perspectives and growth intertwine meaningfully with the player's journey. The next generation of RPGs must treat their characters not as content delivery mechanisms, but as essential elements of a living narrative ecosystem. What lies ahead of the Western RPG is ultimately unwritten, a blank page that developers and players alike will fill through their choices in the coming years. The genre's true potential remains largely untapped despite decades of evolution. The possibility of creating not just games but interactive narrative spaces where players can explore moral complexity, philosophical dilemmas, and emotional depth through the power of embodied choice. This potential resurrection will require courage, from developers willing to prioritize depth over marketability, from publishers willing to support more focused visions, and from players willing to embrace experiences that challenge rather than merely entertain. It will demand a collective return to the understanding that role-playing games are not merely about becoming more powerful within a system, but about exploring the consequences of meaningful choices within richly realized worlds. The Western RPG is not dying but dormant, waiting for the right combination of vision and execution to reawaken its potential. The path forward will not be found in chasing technological spectacle or in endlessly expanded empty worlds, but in returning to the essential truth that has always defined the genre at its best, that the most compelling gameplay emerges not from systems alone, but from the meaningful intersection of player agency with narrative consequence. In this intersection lies the future of role-playing games, not as mere entertainment products, but as a uniquely powerful vehicle for interactive storytelling whose potential we have only begun to explore.